Maria Rodriguez stood outside the biggest house she had ever seen in her life, and her hands were shaking as she held the old folder with her work papers inside it. The building was so tall and shiny that it looked like something from a dream or a movie, and the windows were made of some kind of special glass that showed the purple sky of New Terra, which was the planet where they lived. Now her son Danny was standing right behind her, and he was only 12 years old, and he kept playing, with the straps on his old backpack because he was nervous too. Maria knew that bringing Danny with her was not a good idea, but she had no choice at all, because the shelter where they were staying said they could only stay 3 more days, and after that they would have nowhere to go. The people at the job office had called her yesterday and told her that she got the cleaning job at this big house, but they also said there was no one to watch Danny while she worked. Maria thought about waiting until the next ship came with more people who might help with children, but that ship would not come for another whole month, and they could not wait that long. The big doors opened by themselves without anyone pushing them, and it made a soft sound, like air moving, and inside there was a long hallway that seemed to go on forever. A woman appeared in front of them, but she was not a real woman because she was made of light and she was see-through like a ghost. The light woman said welcome and told Maria that Mr. Sterling was waiting for her in the east wing of the house, and then a blue line appeared on the floor to show them which way to walk. Maria whispered to Danny to stay close to her and not touch anything because everything in this house looked very expensive, and they could not afford to break even the smallest thing. They walked through rooms that had things from Earth and from other planets too, and there were beautiful statues made of crystal, and there were flowers under glass that came from the old Earth gardens that did not exist anymore. There were also machines everywhere that looked so advanced that Maria could not understand what they were for, and some of them seemed to float in the air without anything holding them up. They found Mr. Sterling in a room that looked like a science laboratory, and there were floating screens all around him that showed numbers and pictures of stars and planets. He was younger than Maria thought he would be, and he was. Maybe 40 years old, and his hair had some gray in it, and his eyes looked very smart, like he was always thinking about difficult problems. Everyone on New Terra knew about Gregory Sterling because he was very rich and very smart, and he had invented new ways to change planets so that people could live on them. When they walked into the room, he turned around and looked at them, and his eyes went right to Danny, and Maria felt her heart drop because she thought he was going to be angry that she brought her son, but instead of looking angry, his face became softer and kinder, and he smiled a little bit. He said hello and asked if she was Maria, and then he asked if Danny was her son. Maria started talking very fast, and she said yes. His name is Danny, and she was very sorry for bringing him, but the shelter could not watch him, and she could not find anyone else on such short notice, and she promised it would not happen again. All the words came out in a rush because she was so worried that he would tell her to leave, and then they would have no job and no place to stay. But Mr. Sterling just moved his hand like it was no problem at all, and he said, "Please do not apologize." And then he looked at Danny and asked him how old he was. Danny said he was 12 years old, sir, and his voice was very quiet because he was shy and nervous. Mr. Sterling looked at him for a moment, and then he pointed to one of the floating screens that had a lot of numbers and math problems on it. He asked Danny if he went to school, and Danny looked at his mother first before he answered. Danny said yes, he went to school back on Mars before they came here, but they had not been on New Terra long enough to sign up for school yet. Mr. Sterling asked what his favorite subject was in school, and Danny looked at the floating numbers and said mathematics and physics because he liked learning about how things work. For the first time since they arrived, Mr. Sterling really smiled, and it made his whole face look different and friendlier. He told Danny to come closer and look at the screen with the math problem, and he asked if Danny could tell him what the equation was trying to figure out. Maria felt confused because she did not understand any of the numbers or symbols on the screen. But she watched as Danny stepped forward and his face changed from nervous to interested. Danny stared at the screen for a little while, and then he said, "It looks like a gravity problem, and something about making adjustments for things that have different weights." He pointed at one of the symbols without touching the floating screen, and he said, "This part here would be for making corrections when things change in real time." Mr. Sterling's eyes got wider, and he looked surprised, and he said that was very smart for someone Danny's age. and he asked if Danny had studied advanced physics before. Danny shook his head and said no. Not in a formal way, but he read a lot of books, and the colony library had computers that anyone could use to read and learn. Maria suddenly felt proud but also worried at the same time, because she had not known that Danny spent his time at the library reading university-level science books. There had been so little time for anything, except trying to find work and food and a place to sleep during these past few months. Mr. Sterling turned to look at Maria, and his face was very serious now, and he said he wanted to make her an offer. He said yes. He needed someone to clean and take care of his house, but he also needed something else that was very important. He told her that he was working on a big project that could change everything for New Terra, and maybe for all the human colonies in space. He said the work was very complicated, and he had been trying to find someone who could help him check all his calculations and math. Maria said slowly that she did not understand what that had to do with her. And Mr. Sterling looked at Danny again, and then back at Maria, and he said that her son had something very special. He said Danny had a natural talent that he had not seen in many years, and in just 5 minutes, Danny had spotted a problem that 3 professional scientists had missed. He asked Maria if she knew how rare that kind of ability was. Maria started to say that Danny was just a boy, and yes, he was smart. But Mr. Sterling interrupted her. He said that was exactly the point, because Danny was young enough that his mind had not been limited by the usual ways of thinking. Mr. Sterling said he wanted to hire both of them and Maria would take care of the house like they planned. But Danny would work with him in the laboratory. He said he would teach Danny at home and give him advanced lessons, and in return, Danny would help with the research. Danny would have access to all the books and computers and everything he needed to learn. Maria felt like the room was spinning because this could not be real, and people like Mr. Sterling did not just offer chances like this to poor refugees who had nothing. Maria asked the question that was burning in her mind, and she asked, "Why would you do this for us?" Mr. Sterling walked over to the big windows that showed the land outside, and it was all red and brown dirt that had been changed so people could grow things on it. He said that someone did the same thing for him a long time ago, and he told them that he grew up in the poor parts of Luna City where people lived on the moon. His mother had a job cleaning the machines that made oxygen for people to breathe. And one day a scientist noticed that young Gregory was reading the technical books that the scientist had thrown away. That scientist took a chance on him and gave him access to education that his family could never pay for, and everything that Mr. Sterling had today existed because someone saw his potential and decided to help him grow. He turned around and looked at them both, and he said that Danny had that same special spark, and he could see it clearly. He said that humanity needed smart minds more than ever before because they were spreading out to live on different planets, but life out here in space was fragile and dangerous. Every colony was hanging on by a thin thread, and they needed people who could solve problems that nobody had even thought of yet. Danny spoke up suddenly, and his voice was stronger now, and he asked what the project was that Mr. Sterling needed help with. Mr. Sterling smiled and said he was working on a new kind of machine that could change the air on planets. Right now, it took hundreds of years to make a planet where people could breathe normal air without wearing special breathing masks, but he believed he could make it happen in just a few decades instead. But the math and calculations were extremely complicated, and if he made even one small mistake, it could destroy the whole ecosystem of a planet. Maria could not keep the doubt out of her voice when she asked if he really thought that Danny could help with something that important. Mr. Sterling said that he thought Danny saw patterns in a different way than scientists who had years of training did, and sometimes that was exactly what you needed. A fresh way of looking at things without all the conventional thinking that came from years of doing things the same old way. He looked right at Danny and asked him if he would like to learn real deep knowledge, and not just what they taught in regular schools, but the kind of information that let you change whole worlds. Danny looked at his mother, and his eyes were shining with hope and excitement that Maria had not seen since before they left Mars. Every protective feeling that Maria had was screaming at her to be careful, because this seemed too good to be true. People did not just give away opportunities like this, especially not to desperate refugees who had nothing at all. But when she looked at Mr. Sterling's face, she saw only honesty and truth. And more than that, she saw her own life reflected in his story. She understood what it meant to be poor and to have abilities trapped inside you with no way to let them out. So she forced herself to think practically, and she asked about the details like salary and work hours and where they would live. Mr. Sterling said that both of them would live right here in the house because the East Wing had rooms for staff with private bedrooms. Her pay would be the normal amount for someone who managed a house, plus extra money for Danny's education. Danny would work with him 4 hours each day for 5 days a week, and the rest of his time would be for studying and playing and just being a normal kid. There would be no taking advantage of them and no unreasonable demands. And if at any time Maria felt uncomfortable about anything, she could leave and he would give her 2 months of pay as severance. He made a screen appear in the air that showed the contract with all the legal words, and he said his computer would write up the formal paperwork. She could have a lawyer look at it if she wanted, and she could take a few days to think about it because there was no pressure to decide right away. Maria read the words floating in the air, and her eyes got very wide when she saw how much money he was offering to pay her. It was more than she had made in her best year back on Mars, and the education benefits alone were worth more than everything she and Danny owned. Put together, Danny spoke quietly and asked if he could ask one question. Mr. Sterling said, of course he could ask anything. Danny asked if Mr. Sterling really truly thought he could help with the planet-changing project. He said he was not trying to pretend to be humble, but he did not have any formal training. And what if he made mistakes? That messed everything up. Mr. Sterling got down on one knee so he was at the same height as Danny, and he could look the boy right in his eyes. He said that everyone made mistakes, and that was how people learned and grew. He was not expecting Danny to be perfect at everything, and he was expecting him to be curious and ask questions and see connections that other people missed. Danny's value was not in what he already knew, but in how his brain worked and thought about problems. From what Mr. Sterling had seen in just the last 10 minutes, Danny thought in ways that could change everything. He stood back up and looked at Maria, and he said that her son was special, but not in some vague way that people say about all children. Danny had a real, genuine gift for understanding complicated systems. He could see it in the way Danny's eyes followed those math equations and how he asked questions about the variables instead of just accepting the formulas as they were. That was not something anyone could teach because it was natural and built into who Danny was. Maria asked what would happen when the project was finished and when Mr. Sterling did not need Danny's help anymore. Mr. Sterling said that by then Danny would be years ahead of other kids his age. He would have knowledge and connections that would open doors all across the human colonies in space. If Danny wanted to pursue science, Mr. Sterling would write recommendations that would get him into any university in all of human space. If Danny wanted something else, he would have the foundation to do well at whatever he chose. This was not just a temporary opportunity, but a chance to change the whole direction of Danny's entire life. Maria felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but these were good tears of the kind she had almost forgotten existed. They were tears of relief and gratitude and hope for a future she had stopped believing was possible. She looked at Danny and saw his face full of excitement and wonder, and she knew what her answer had to be. She said yes, they would accept his offer, and she thanked him for seeing potential in her son, when everyone else only saw a poor boy from a shelter. Mr. Sterling smiled warmly and said that he was the one who should be grateful because Danny was going to help him solve problems that had kept him stuck for months. He told them they could move in within 3 days, and he would have everything ready for them. 3 days later, Maria and Danny moved into the Sterling estate with all their belongings, which fit into just 2 old suitcases. Maria's bedroom was bigger than the entire apartment they had lived in back on Mars, and it had huge windows from the floor to the ceiling that showed the gardens outside. In the gardens, there were plants from Earth growing right next to plants that were native to New Terra, and somehow they all grew together in perfect balance. Danny's room was right next door, connected by a door that he could lock if he wanted privacy. His room had its own desk with a computer built into it, and the shelves were already full of textbooks that Mr. Sterling had picked out just for him. There was also a floating screen for looking at the house's huge digital library, which had thousands and thousands of books. On the first morning, Maria woke up before the sun came up. Because that was an old habit from working many jobs for many years, She found Mr. Sterling already in the kitchen, making coffee the old way with hot water in a special pot. He said she did not have to wake up this early because her work did not start until 8 o'clock. Maria said it was just old habits, and she took the cup of coffee he poured for her without asking if she wanted one. She told him that she was still not sure if all of this was really happening. Mr. Sterling said it was real, and he told her that he wanted her to understand something important. She was not a servant in this house, and yes, she was an employee. But more than that, she was a partner in helping Danny grow and learn. He would need her help to know when Danny was feeling overwhelmed, or when he needed breaks, or when something was not working. Well, Mr. Sterling said he was good with physics and science, but he was not a parent, and Maria was Danny's first work session in the laboratory was scheduled for 9 o'clock that morning. Maria stood by the doorway watching as Mr. Sterling brought up the same floating screen with math problems that they had seen on their first visit, but this time he started explaining everything from the very beginning. He said this was the current best technology for changing planet atmospheres, and these machines worked by making chemical reactions happen at the very tiny molecular level. The problem was that the machines needed huge amounts of energy, which meant they needed special fusion reactors, which cost enormous amounts of money to build. He asked Danny if he was following along so far, and Danny nodded with his full attention on the floating pictures. Mr. Sterling explained that his new idea used special tiny structures that were stabilized with quantum physics, and this could reduce the energy needed by a factor of 10, but there was a big problem because the math for making this work on a whole planet was incredibly complicated. Every variable interacted with every other variable in ways that were not simple or predictable. If you changed one thing, then a dozen other things would shift in directions you did not expect. He pulled up a 3-dimensional graph that showed hundreds of lines crossing each other, and he said this was a simple model of just one small area of atmosphere. Each line represented a different chemical pathway or reaction. Now imagine this scaled up to cover an entire planet, and you had to factor in things like sunlight and seasonal changes and geological activity and thousands of other factors. Danny said quietly that it was like a puzzle, with many dimensions where every piece affected every other piece. Mr. Sterling smiled and said exactly right, and here was where Danny would help. He needed someone who could look at all these interactions and spot patterns and not just follow the math but see the shape of the whole system at once. Danny said he thought he understood, and Mr. Sterling wanted him to find shortcuts or ways to make things simpler without losing accuracy. Mr. Sterling said yes, but not just shortcuts, but real insights and understanding. He highlighted a group of variables on the screen and said his computer simulation suggested this reaction would stabilize within 3 weeks. But he did not trust it because the model seemed too clean, like it was missing something important. He asked Danny what he saw when he looked at it. Danny studied the floating display for several long minutes, and Maria watched nervously because she was afraid her son was about to disappoint this man who had given them so much. But then, Danny's face changed and his eyes got brighter. He said suddenly that it was the nitrogen cycle. The model assumed that nitrogen would be fixed at constant rates, but that was not correct. If the oxygen percentage went up as the atmosphere became more breathable, then the bacteria that fixed nitrogen would experience population booms and crashes in cycles that would create waves and oscillations through the whole system. The stabilization would not be smooth, but would be like a dampened wave, with each cycle smaller than the last but never completely smooth. Mr. Sterling stared at the display and then started pulling up more data very quickly. He said the bacterial populations and that he had not thought of them as active variables because they were too small to measure directly. But Danny was absolutely right, because if the oxygen levels went up and down, the bacteria would respond, and that would feed back into the atmospheric chemistry. He ran a new simulation that included Danny's insight and told him to look at the results. The timeline now extended to 5 weeks instead of 3, and there were 3 distinct periods where the system would become unstable. If they had not caught this mistake, the entire system could have crashed and failed during the 2nd week. Mr. Sterling turned to Danny with a look of amazement and respect on his face. He said that was exactly the kind of thinking he needed, and he asked Danny how he had seen that problem. Danny shrugged, feeling suddenly self-conscious and shy. He said he did not really know how he saw it, but it just seemed obvious to him. If you changed one part of an ecosystem, then everything connected to it would change too. The bacteria were not just sitting there doing nothing, but were active parts of the system. Mr. Sterling explained that this was called systems thinking. Most scientists were trained to isolate variables and study things in controlled laboratory conditions. That worked fine for lab research, but it failed. When you were dealing with the huge complexity of an entire planet, Danny had instinctively understood that the bacteria were players in the game and not just scenery in the background. That ability was truly remarkable and special. Maria stood in the doorway, feeling her heart swell with pride as she watched her son discuss complicated science with one of the smartest men in the colony. Over the next few weeks, Maria watched her son change and grow in ways that filled her heart with joy. Danny was still the same boy who loved terrible jokes and collected interesting rocks from the garden, but there was something new growing inside. He walked differently now, with his shoulders back and his head held high, and he spoke more clearly without mumbling or looking at the ground. When he asked questions, he did not apologize for taking up space or wasting anyone's time. Mr. Sterling kept every promise he had made about not exploiting Danny or working him too hard. Every single day at exactly 1 o'clock, the laboratory sessions would end, and Danny would have lunch. After that, he could spend the afternoon however he wanted to, and sometimes he studied from the library. Other times he would explore the huge estate grounds and look at all the different plants and animals that lived there. Twice every week, Mr. Sterling arranged for other children from the colony to come visit, so that Danny would not become lonely or isolated from kids his own age. One evening, about 2 months after they moved in, Maria found Mr. Sterling in his study staring at floating pictures of New Terra's atmosphere. She asked if there were problems with the project. Mr. Sterling turned and smiled and said, "Actually, there were solutions, not problems." He told her that Danny had found another critical mistake in his models. That very day, Danny had pointed out that the temperature calculations did not account for how ocean currents moved heat around. It seemed obvious once someone pointed it out, but 3 different teams of experts had completely missed it. Danny had seen it in just a few minutes of looking at the data. Maria asked if that was good or bad for the project. Mr. Sterling said it was extraordinary and he needed to tell her something important. He had been talking with the Colonial Council about using this new technology on New Terra. The council members were skeptical, as they should be, because changing planets was expensive and dangerous. One wrong calculation could make things worse instead of better, and could even destroy the planet's ability to support life. But with Danny's help, he had refined the mathematical models to a point where he thought he could convince the council that it would work. The council had agreed to hear a presentation next week. Mr. Sterling paused and chose his next words carefully. He said he would like Danny to present with him to show the council what young human minds were capable of doing, but only if Maria was comfortable with it, and only if Danny wanted to do it. Maria's first thought was to say no, because Danny was still just a child. The Colonial Council was made up of tough administrators and scientists who had survived the early dangerous days of starting the colony. They were not known for being patient or sentimental with people who wasted their time. But then Maria remembered the look on Danny's face that first day when Mr. Sterling talked about changing worlds. She remembered the hunger and excitement in his eyes, so she told Mr. Sterling to ask Danny and let him decide for himself. Danny said yes before Mr. Sterling even finished explaining what he was asking. He said he wanted to show the council members what they had figured out about the bacterial cycles and the ocean currents and all the other discoveries. He asked if this technology could really help everyone on New Terra. Mr. Sterling said yes. If it worked, it could cut decades off the planet-changing timeline. That meant people could breathe normal air without special masks much sooner. There would be more land suitable for farming and growing food. The costs for everything would be lower for everyone in the colony, Danny said. Then he definitely wanted to help with the presentation. The presentation was held in the council chambers, which was a big circular room with windows showing the reddish-brown landscape of New Terra that had not been converted yet. 30 council members sat in rising rows of seats, and their faces looked skeptical and doubtful. Even before Mr. Sterling began speaking, Maria sat in the section for observers, and her hands were clenched so tight that her knuckles turned white. Danny stood beside Mr. Sterling at the central speaking platform, and he looked impossibly small in his formal clothes. Mr. Sterling began by giving the technical overview and explaining his quantum-stabilized catalysts and energy efficiency improvements. Council members listened with the tired patience of people who had heard countless promises before that never came true. Then Mr. Sterling turned to Danny and gestured for him to step forward. He said that his young colleague had identified several critical factors that the initial models had overlooked. He asked Danny to explain the bacterial oscillation problem. Danny took a deep breath and then started speaking. His voice was steady and clear and strong. He explained the nitrogen cycle and the feedback loops and the wave patterns that would happen during stabilization. He used the floating screens naturally and easily, highlighting key points and showing the data that supported his conclusions. One of the council members was a stern woman named Helena Price, and she interrupted Danny's presentation. She said, "Young man, these are very sophisticated concepts," and she asked if Mr. Sterling had taught Danny what to say. Danny replied without hesitation and said no. Ma'am, Mr. Sterling had explained the original models to him, but Danny had noticed that the nitrogen-fixing bacteria would respond to oxygen level changes, because that was how ecosystems worked. Everything affected everything else in nature. Once Danny mentioned it, they ran new simulations together to test the idea, and the data confirmed that he was correct. Another council member asked about the ocean current corrections and whether that was also Danny's insight. Danny said, "Yes, sir, it was. The original temperature models treated the atmosphere as if it was relatively static and unchanging. But New Terra had oceans, and oceans moved heat around from place to place. Warm water flowed to cold regions, and cold water flowed to warm regions. That changed the local temperatures, which changed the atmospheric chemistry in those areas. If you did not account for this movement, your predictions would be wrong." The council chamber became completely silent, and Maria could see the council members looking at each other. Some of them looked skeptical, but others looked thoughtful and impressed. Helena Price leaned forward in her seat and looked directly at Danny. She asked him how old he was. Danny answered that he was 12 years old. "Ma'am." Helena asked where he had studied planetary science. Danny said he had not studied it formally anywhere. He read textbooks from the public library, and Mr. Sterling had been teaching him more advanced material over the past few months. Helena looked over at Mr. Sterling and asked if this was genuine. She wanted to know if the boy had actually contributed these insights or if he was just being used as a prop. Mr. Sterling said that Danny really did contribute all of these ideas. He was not using Danny to make the presentation look better. Danny had a natural talent for systems thinking that Mr. Sterling himself lacked. His contributions had been essential and necessary for refining the models to the point where they might actually work. Another long silence filled the chamber, and Maria could feel her heart pounding so hard, she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Then Helena smiled, and it was the first genuine warmth that Maria had seen from any of the council members. She said this was what humanity was supposed to be about, taking care of the young people and nurturing talent wherever they found it, building a future that was better than the past they had left behind. She said that Mr. Sterling had the council's approval for a pilot program. They would give him funding to build 3 atmospheric processors to be placed in the northern area of the planet. If his models proved to be accurate and worked as predicted, they would expand the program to cover the entire colony. Then Helena looked directly at Danny with kindness in her eyes. She said, "Young man, the council was establishing a scholarship program in his name. Every child in the colony who had ability but no money would have access to advanced education. Danny had shown them that genius did not wait for credentials or formal training. It was their duty to find it and feed it wherever it existed." The chamber erupted into discussion with council members calling out questions about how to implement the program and allocate resources and ensure safety. But Maria barely heard any of the noise and talking. She was watching her son's face and seeing the pride there and the sense of real accomplishment. He had done something real and important that would matter to people's lives. That evening back at the estate, Mr. Sterling opened a bottle of special non-alcoholic champagne. To celebrate, Danny was exhausted, but his whole face was glowing with excitement. He kept talking about every moment of the presentation and retelling all the details. He said, "Did you see their faces when I explained the bacterial cycles?" At first he thought Councillor Price was going to tell him to leave, but then she smiled. Maria interrupted him gently and told him to go get ready for bed because it was very late. When Danny was gone, she turned to Mr. Sterling. She said she did not know how to thank him for giving her son a future. More than just a future, he had given Danny a sense of purpose. Mr. Sterling said he had told her before that someone had done the same thing for him many years ago. He was just paying that kindness forward to the next generation. And honestly, Danny had helped him just as much as he had helped Danny. Those insights that Danny provided were genuine and real. Without them, Mr. Sterling's project would have failed, catastrophically. Danny had saved him from making terrible mistakes that could have hurt people. Maria asked what would happen now with the scholarship program and with Danny's education going forward. Mr. Sterling said that was completely up to Maria and Danny to decide. If Danny wanted to continue working with him on the project, he would be honored. But Danny was still young and he should explore different things and find his own path in life. Maybe he would stay in planetary science, or maybe he would discover a passion for something completely different. The important point was that Danny would have real choices now. Not just survival, but actual options for what he wanted to do with his life. Mr. Sterling paused and looked out at the gardens that had been transformed and made beautiful. He said that the real lesson here was not just about Danny being exceptional, even though he clearly was. It was about how many other kids like Danny were out there right now across all the colonies. There were brilliant minds trapped in poverty and difficult circumstances, never getting the chance to develop their gifts and abilities. If humanity was going to thrive out here among the stars, they needed to find those kids. They needed to find all of them and help them. Humanity's greatest resource was not the minerals they mined or the energy they produced or even the technology they invented. The greatest resource was human potential itself. Maria felt tears forming in her eyes, but she did not wipe them away. They were good tears of the kind she had almost forgotten could exist. These were tears of relief and gratitude and hope for the future. She said softly that Mr. Sterling was absolutely right, and she thanked him for seeing potential in Danny, for seeing past the worn-out clothes and the shelter address and all the other things that made them look poor. She thanked him for really seeing her son for who he truly was. Mr. Sterling smiled warmly and said that Danny had made it easy because his talent shined so brightly. Anyone who took the time to look would have seen it. The tragedy was how many people never got the chance to have someone look at them that way. But now with the scholarship program, they were going to change that. They were going to make sure that every child with ability would get the opportunity to develop it. That night, Maria lay in her comfortable bed looking out at the stars through her window. She thought about how far they had come in just a few short months, from desperate refugees with nowhere to go to this beautiful place, where Danny could learn and grow. She thought about all the other families out there who were still struggling, all the other children whose talents might never be discovered, and she made a silent promise to herself that she would help make sure the scholarship program succeeded. She would help find those children and give them the chances that Danny had been given, because that was what humanity should be about, lifting each other up and helping each person reach their full potential. 3 years passed, and during that time, many wonderful things happened on New Terra. The northern area of the planet became the first region where people could breathe normal Earth-like air without wearing special breathing masks. The project was completed 8 full years ahead of the original schedule that the old technology would have required, and it cost only a small fraction of what the colonial government had budgeted to spend. Danny Rodriguez was now 15 years old, and his name appeared on the published scientific papers as a contributing researcher. But something even more important had happened during those 3 years. 43 other children from struggling families across New Terra were now enrolled in advanced education programs. These programs were funded by the Rodriguez Scholarship Fund that the council had created. The children studied everything from physics about stars to biology about alien life forms. They learned engineering and mathematics, and some studied art and music. Some of these children would grow up to become scientists, while others would become artists or administrators or explorers. All of them would have the chance to develop their gifts and talents. All of them would be able to contribute to humanity's future among the stars in their own unique ways. Maria still worked at the Sterling estate, but her job had changed completely. She was no longer just a housekeeper, cleaning rooms and doing laundry. She had trained and learned to become an administrative coordinator. Her job now was to help manage the growing network of scholarship programs that had spread to other colonies beyond New Terra. She reviewed applications from families who needed help. She connected talented, young people with mentors who could teach them. She made absolutely sure that no child with potential fell through the cracks of society. Every morning when Maria walked through the gardens that Danny had helped make possible, she remembered that desperate day when she stood at the gates. She had stood there with nothing but hope and a worn folder full of work papers. She remembered the fear that had gripped her heart and the uncertainty about what would happen to them. She remembered the crushing weight of poverty and not knowing where they would sleep or how they would eat. But mostly she remembered the exact moment when Gregory Sterling looked at her son. That moment when he saw not just a poor boy from a shelter, but a brilliant mind that could change the world. That single moment of recognition had transformed everything. Danny was thriving now in ways that Maria had never dared to dream about. He was still curious and excited about learning new things. He had been accepted into an advanced research program at the Colonial University. Several other colonies had reached out offering him opportunities to work on their own planetary transformation projects. But more importantly, Danny had not lost his kindness or his sense of wonder about the universe. He volunteered to tutor younger children in the scholarship program. He remembered what it felt like to have nothing, and he wanted to help others the way he had been helped. One evening, Maria and Danny were sitting together on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and orange. Danny said quietly that he had been thinking about something. Maria asked what he was thinking about. Danny said he wanted to expand the scholarship program even more. He had been doing calculations, and if they could get more funding, they could help hundreds more children across all the human colonies. Maria smiled because this was exactly the kind of thinking that made her proud. Not thinking about himself and his own success, but thinking about how to help others. She asked him what his plan was. Danny explained that several wealthy corporations were making huge profits from the new atmospheric processing technology. If he could convince them to donate a small percentage of their profits, it would fund scholarships for thousands of children. The return on investment would be enormous because those children would grow up to become the scientists and engineers and leaders that humanity needed. Maria looked at her son with tears of pride in her eyes. He was only 15, but he was already thinking like a leader and a changemaker. She told him that she thought it was a wonderful idea, and she would help him however she could. Mr. Sterling joined them on the terrace carrying 3 cups of hot tea. He had heard their conversation and he was grinning widely. He said that Danny's idea was brilliant, and he already had connections with several corporate boards. He would help Danny prepare a presentation that would convince them to invest in human potential. Maria realized in that moment that this was the real essence of what made humanity special. It was not about having the best technology or the strongest ships or even the smartest scientists. What made humanity special was this exact thing happening right now on this terrace. People from different backgrounds and situations coming together to lift each other up, seeing potential in others and taking concrete action to help that potential grow, recognizing that every single person had something valuable to contribute. That night after Danny went to bed, Maria stood at her window looking out at the transformed landscape of New Terra. In the distance she could see the lights of the colony town spreading across the land. Each light represented a family, and in each family there might be a child with extraordinary potential, children who were waiting for someone to notice them and believe in them, children who could become the next generation of problem solvers and innovators and leaders. She thought about how easily Danny could have been lost if they had not gotten the job at the Sterling estate. If Mr. Sterling had not taken the time to talk to Danny that first day, if he had not recognized the spark of genius and decided to nurture it. How many other children were being lost right now because no one was looking? That question kept Maria awake for a long time, but it also gave her a sense of purpose and mission. She would spend the rest of her life making sure that fewer children were lost. She would work to build a system where every child had a chance, where poverty did not determine destiny, and where talent was recognized regardless of circumstances. That was the future worth fighting for. 5 years after that terrace conversation, Danny Rodriguez stood in front of the Intercolonial Education Summit. He was 20 years old now, and representatives from 17 different human colonies had gathered to hear him speak. The summit was being held on Mars in one of the huge domed conference centers that could hold thousands of people. Danny had prepared a presentation about expanding the scholarship network across all of human space. But before he began his formal presentation, he asked if he could tell a story. He told them about a 12-year-old boy who stood in a mansion with his mother who was applying for a cleaning job. He told them about living in a shelter and not knowing where the next meal would come from. He told them about a man who looked past the worn clothes and the circumstances and saw potential instead. He told them about learning that every child deserved a chance regardless of where they started in life. The audience sat in complete silence listening to his words. Many of them had their own stories of struggle and hardship. Many of them understood exactly what Danny was talking about. Then Danny showed them the data, and the numbers were stunning. The Rodriguez Scholarship Program had now helped over 300 children across 6 colonies. Those 300 children were already making contributions to their communities. They were designing better life support systems and discovering new crops that could grow in alien soil. They were writing music and creating art that brought joy to colonists living far from Earth. They were becoming teachers and doctors and engineers and everything else that a growing civilization needed. But Danny explained that 300 was not nearly enough based on his research. There were potentially tens of thousands of children across all human colonies who had talent, but lacked opportunity. The cost of helping all of them was significant, but it was a fraction of what the colonies spent on other infrastructure, and the return on investment would be immeasurable, because every child they helped today could become the person who solved tomorrow's crisis. Every scholarship they funded might produce the scientist who cured a disease, or the engineer who designed a safer spacecraft, or the leader who united colonies in cooperation. He proposed a unified funding system where all colonies would contribute based on their economic capacity. Wealthy, established colonies would contribute more while struggling new colonies would contribute less. But every colony would benefit from the network because talented children would be free to move where their skills were most needed. Maria watched from the audience with tears streaming down her face. Her son had grown into someone she barely recognized from that scared 12-year-old. Yet he was still fundamentally the same person, with the same kindness and the same drive to help others. Mr. Sterling sat beside her, and he leaned over to whisper that he was proud of both of them. When Danny finished his presentation, the summit delegates voted almost unanimously to adopt his proposal. The Intercolonial Talent Initiative was born that day. It would eventually grow to become one of the most important institutions in human space. But on that day, it was simply a promise that humanity would not waste its greatest resource, which was the potential locked inside every child. After the summit ended, there was a reception where delegates mingled and discussed the details of implementation. Maria found herself talking to a woman named Lisa Chen, who was a delegate from the Tau Ceti colony. Lisa had tears in her eyes as she thanked Maria. She explained that she had 3 children back home, and her youngest daughter was brilliant with languages. The girl could already speak 5 different human languages and was learning to communicate with the dolphin descendants that lived in Tau Ceti's oceans. But Lisa and her husband were farmers who could barely afford basic schooling. There was no way they could pay for the kind of advanced linguistic training their daughter needed. Now, because of the initiative, her daughter would have that chance. Maria hugged Lisa and told her that this was exactly why. They were doing this work so that families like Lisa's would not have to watch their children's talents go to waste. Later that evening, the 3 of them sat together in a quiet restaurant overlooking the Martian landscape. Maria and Danny and Mr. Sterling shared a meal and talked about the future. Mr. Sterling raised his glass in a toast. He said, "Here is to the moment when I met a scared boy and his brave mother. Here is to taking chances on people. Here is to recognizing that genius wears many faces and comes from unexpected places." Maria added her own toast. She said, "Here is to kindness and generosity. Here is to seeing the best in people and helping them become who they are meant to be." Danny raised his glass last, and his voice was thick with emotion. He said, "Here is to humanity. Here is to our ability to lift each other up and carry each other forward. Here is to building a future where every child can reach for the stars, not just metaphorically but literally. They clinked their glasses together, and in that moment they all understood something profound. This was what made humanity special among all the species that might exist in the universe. Not intelligence alone, because other species might be equally or more intelligent. Not technology, because technology was just a tool that anyone could develop given enough time. What made humanity special was this exact quality: the ability to recognize potential in others, the willingness to invest in that potential even when there was no guarantee of return. The deep understanding that every individual mattered and that a civilization could only be as great as it allowed its people to become. That night, Maria lay in her hotel room, unable to sleep because her mind was racing with thoughts and memories. She thought about that desperate day 8 years ago when she had stood at the gates of the Sterling estate. She had been so afraid and so hopeless. She had thought that she was going to lose Danny to a life of poverty and missed opportunities, but instead, one man's kindness had changed everything, not just for her and Danny, but now for thousands of children across human space. One act of recognition had created ripples that spread outward, touching countless lives. She wondered how many other acts of kindness were happening right now across the colonies. How many other children were being given chances that would change their lives, and she felt grateful beyond words that she had been part of starting this movement, grateful that her son had been the catalyst for something so much bigger than any of them, as she finally drifted off to sleep. Maria smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. But she was ready for whatever came next, because she had learned the most important lesson of all: that hope and potential existed everywhere if you were willing to look for it. 20 years after that first meeting at the Sterling estate, the human colonies had spread even further across the galaxy. New Terra was now completely transformed with breathable atmosphere. Across 90% of the planet's surface forests grew where once there had been only red dust and children played outside without breathing masks. Maria Rodriguez was now in her 60s, and she had become one of the most respected administrators in all of human space. The Intercolonial Talent Initiative had helped over 50,000 children during those 2 decades. Those children had grown up, and many of them were now contributing in amazing ways to humanity's future. Danny Rodriguez was 32 years old, and he had become the chief science advisor for the Colonial Council. His work had helped transform 7 different planets, making them suitable for human habitation. But he was most proud of the mentoring network he had built, where successful scholars helped guide the next generation. Gregory Sterling was older now, with completely white hair, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He had spent the last decade working on new technologies that would make space travel safer and more accessible. He often joked that Danny had taught him more than he had ever taught Danny. One evening, they all gathered at the Sterling estate for a special celebration. It was the 20th anniversary of the Rodriguez Scholarship Fund. Hundreds of former scholarship recipients had traveled from across the colonies to attend. They filled the gardens and the halls, sharing stories of how the program had changed their lives. Maria moved through the crowd, listening to their stories, and each one filled her heart with joy. There was Sophie Kim, who had grown up in the slums of Europa and was now developing new forms of sustainable energy. There was Marcus Johnson, who had been a homeless teenager on Titan and was now writing novels that were read across all human colonies. There was Amira Patel, who had come from a refugee camp on Ganymede and was now a doctor, saving lives on the frontier worlds. Each person had their own story of struggle and triumph. Each one represented a potential that might have been lost if not for someone recognizing their worth. When it came time for speeches, Maria stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces. She told them about standing at those gates 20 years ago, with nothing but desperation and a dream. She told them about the moment when one man chose to see potential instead of poverty, and she told them that every single one of them in this room had the power to do the same thing for someone else. The power to change a life with a single act of recognition and support. She said that this was humanity's true strength, not the ships they built or the planets they terraformed or the technology they invented. Their strength was in their ability to lift each other up, to see value in every person regardless of their circumstances, to invest in potential, even when the returns were uncertain. That night after the celebration ended, Maria walked through the gardens with Danny and Mr. Sterling. The three of them had been through so much together. They had built something that would outlast all of them, a system that ensured no child's potential would be wasted simply because they were born into the wrong circumstances. Danny said quietly that he had been thinking about the future. He said that humanity was now making contact with other intelligent species in the galaxy. Some of these species were more technologically advanced than humans. Some had been traveling the stars for thousands of years. But Danny had noticed something interesting in the first contact reports. Many of these species were puzzled by how quickly humanity had spread and adapted. They were surprised by human creativity and problem-solving abilities. Danny believed he knew why. It was because humanity did not waste its potential. Other species had rigid social structures where your birth determined your destiny. But humanity had learned to recognize and develop talent wherever it appeared. A poor child from a shelter could become a chief science advisor. A refugee could become a doctor or a writer or an engineer. This social mobility and willingness to invest in everyone gave humanity a massive advantage. Mr. Sterling nodded thoughtfully and said that Danny was absolutely right. He said that when other species looked at humanity, they saw something rare. They saw a species that valued every individual, that understood that genius could come from anywhere, that built systems to ensure no one was left behind. Maria looked up at the stars and thought about all the worlds out there. All the children who would be born on those worlds in the years to come. She hoped that the system they had built would continue to grow and evolve, that future generations would remember why it mattered to invest in people, that the lesson of recognizing potential would never be forgotten. Danny put his arm around his mother's shoulders and said that they had done well. The three of them had started something that would last for generations. They had proven that kindness and recognition could change the world, that one person seeing potential in another person could create ripples that touch countless lives. Years later, when historians looked back at this period of human expansion, they would identify several key factors that explained humanity's success. They would talk about technological innovation and resource management and strategic colonization. But the wisest historians would point to something else. They would point to programs like the Rodriguez Scholarship Fund. They would point to the cultural shift that happened when humanity decided that every child mattered. They would explain that this was what made humanity special among the stars. Not technological superiority or military might or even intelligence, but the deep belief that every person carried infinite potential, and that a civilization could only be as great as it allowed its people to become. This was the gift that Gregory Sterling had given to Maria and Danny that day, 20 years ago. Not just opportunity for one family, but a model for an entire civilization. A reminder that the most valuable resource in the universe was not gold or rare elements or even energy. It was the untapped potential inside every human being. As Maria stood in those gardens looking up at the stars with her son and her friend beside her, she felt complete peace. She had started this journey as a desperate mother trying to survive. She was ending it as someone who had helped change the course of human history, not through grand gestures or dramatic actions, but through the simple act of recognizing and nurturing potential. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.